All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started. I think one thing we've learned today is my father, he would always say, you can have good, fast, and cheap, but you can't have all three at the same time. And I think that we've learned that we can have streaming, video, or audio, but we can't have all three at the same time. So I'm believing that we have just two for this presentation, but I am very excited to welcome our next roundtable session, Uncovering an Intersectional Women's History Through Digital Editions. And this is all stuff that I'm interested in for my own research subjects. So I'm just really excited to hear from the roundtable. And I'd like to turn it over now to Deb Gusman, who is going to chair this roundtable. Deb?
Hi, everyone. I'm not going to say that we've saved the best for last, but I'm really excited about this panel. I'll just say that. So I'm Deborah Gusman. I'm pinch hitting for Noelle Baker, who was originally the chair of this program. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a professor of American literature and women's gender and sexuality studies at Stockton University, and I'm a project co-editor of the Catherine Maria Sedgwick online letters. I'm going to introduce all of the panelists all at once because this is a round table, so everyone's going to give a short presentation. You'll be able to remember who everyone is by the time they get to their next one. And then I have some questions and we'll open it up to questions from all of you. Okay, so our first panelist today will be Kathy Moran-Hadjo, whose talk is Excavating in the Trenches of Women's History, the Jane Addams Papers. Kathy holds a BA from Ramapo College of New Jersey, a certificate in archival management, and an MA and PhD from New York University. She's been with the Jane Addams Papers at Ramapo since 2015, directing the production of the Jane Addams digital edition and the completion of the selected papers of Jane Addams, a 6-volume print edition. Before this, she worked for over 25 years as the associate editor and assistant director of the Margaret Sanger Papers at New York University, assisting in the production of the Margaret Sanger Papers microfilm edition, the 4-volume selected papers of Margaret Sanger, and 2 digital publications, Margaret Sanger and the Woman Rebel, and the public writings and speeches of Margaret Sanger, 1911 to 1960. She wrote Birth Control on Main Street, Organizing Clinics in the United States. Kathy's also taught editing and digital history courses for NYU, William Patterson University, and for the Institute for Editing Historical Documents. She currently co-teaches a course on digital editions for the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, and recently contributed 5 courses to eLabs that form part of the fundamentals of publishing historical documents. She teaches Discovering Digital History, an undergraduate course offered at Ramapo College, and is active in digital humanities at Ramapo and nearby colleges. Kathy was the president, as many of you know, of the Association for Documentary Editing from 2008 to 2009, and has held many committee roles in offices with the association. And she is also a board member and archival director for the Mawa Museum. And we're glad she made time for us. Our next speakers together, Gabriella, Baeza, Ventura, and Carolina Villaroel, will be talking about documenting U.S. Latino writings in archives and beyond. Gabriella is the executive director and co-director of the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center and associate professor of Spanish with a specialization on U.S. Latinx literature in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston. She is executive editor at Acapulco Press, the premier Latino publishing house, and co-founder of the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center. Baeza Ventura has published on various aspects of U.S. Latino literature and digital humanities, including women, immigration, recovery works, language, and young adult and children's literary production. Baeza Ventura was selected to participate in the Committee of the Next Generation Historical and Scholarly Digital Editions by the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and the National Endowment for the Humanities to advise on U.S. Latinx archives and data collecting to NHPRC, and appointed to the Mellon ACLS-funded Commission on Fostering and Sustaining Diverse Digital Scholarship. Carolina A. Villaroel holds a PhD in Spanish, holds a PhD in Spanish literature with a specialization in U.S. Latino literature and women's studies from the University of Houston. She is the former archivist in charge of Mexican American and African American collections at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center at the Houston Public Library at the Houston Public Library. Her expertise in U.S. Latino literature and culture has been fundamental to her positions at University of Houston, where she is the Brown Foundation Director of Research of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage, a national program whose goal is to identify, preserve, study, and make accessible the written production of Latinos as in the United States from the colonial period until 1980. She and her colleague, Gabriella Baeza Ventura, are also the founders of the first U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center in the nation. The center was funded by a generous grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And last but not least, Lindsay R. Peterson will be talking about recovery and discoverability of women's voices, the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi project. Lindsay R. Peterson received a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Southern Mississippi and an MA in history from the University of South Dakota. Her research has been published in Civil War history, the Middle West Review, and Teaching Gradually, Practical Pedagogy for Graduate Students by graduate students. Dr. Peterson's current manuscript project examines the intersection of race, gender, and place in Westerners' Union Civil War commemorations to reveal how Western Unionists remembered and celebrated the American Civil War to bolster their competing visions of Western expansion and social order. She currently teaches the U.S. history sequence and upper level history courses as an instructor at the University of Sioux Falls in South Dakota. And she has worked as a researcher on a number of digital editions and is currently the associate editor of the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi project, which is digitizing, transcribing, and annotating nearly 20,000 records from Mississippi's governor's offices and making them freely available online. Is this a distinguished panel or what? Okay, so I am now going to turn it over to our panelists who are going to each give a brief presentation and then we'll have a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. The main goal of the Jane Addams papers is to make accessible to a broad audience of scholars, teachers, and students, the papers that she's written, the speeches, the articles, the correspondence, and diaries. That means that we digitize the images and create transcriptions and describe the documents using metadata to make them more discoverable. We have an anticipated total of about 25,000 documents in the edition. And so we had to simplify annotation for this edition to make it more about identifying people, organizations, events, and publications that were important to the collection. And today I'm going to focus mostly, where did I do it over there? I don't see where the button is. Okay, I went too far. On people. So our editorial policy has been to try to create a biographical entry on the digital edition for every person mentioned in the edition. That is not a fictional person. And they can be mentioned indirectly or directly. So if someone says the president or someone says, the head of the college, if we can identify who they're talking about, we will try to do an actual identification. When we started the project, I don't think we thought that we would have as many documents as we do people, but we do. It's been neck and neck since we started the project. And we really thought that, she has a core bunch of people and there'll be a few outliers, but no, that core keeps changing. So we currently have about 15,000 documents and we also have about 15,000 people. So as we build the resource, what's struck me is that we're not only just documenting Addams's papers and her life and kind of showing how people all connect to it, but we're really starting to rebuild her network of people. We are documenting the efforts of charities in Chicago and social justice organizations that she was involved with. So she starts out first with settlement workers, some in Chicago, but some in other northeastern cities. And then she starts working with prominent people in Chicago and then moves on to larger networks like suffrage, child labor activists, social workers, and then eventually peace activists become the main focus of the second half of her life. So she starts small in Chicago, and most of our people in the beginning are either her family members or people that she went to college with or people that are at Hull House with her, but it rapidly increases and it becomes something where we've got people in many different continents. Let's see if I can make that happen again. Yeah. So we have a lot of people in the database, as I said, and it's sometimes not too difficult to find biographical information on them. A lot of the people that she knew were also prominent progressives. Most of the presidents are in there, a lot of the important political people, leaders of women's rights movements and things like that. And so most of the people we've got, they're reasonably wealthy. They have obituaries. Some of them have Wikipedia entries or, biographies or obituaries in newspapers and things like that. They're not terribly difficult to find. But when I actually started looking at the numbers, we have about 42% of the collection are women. And at first I was surprised. I thought there should be more women than men, but even if you're a women's activist, you're dealing in a male controlled world. And if you need to get things done, you're talking about men, you're talking to men, you're dealing with that. But today we're talking about the women. But when you're trying to figure out how prominent these people are. And one thing I did is we have a source for some of the biographies that we did. And sometimes if we see a Wikipedia site, we'll cite it, just so people can go there and learn more. So what we found looking at is that 40% of the men in our edition have Wikipedia sites, but only 17% of the women do. So even though we're dealing with people that some of whom are prominent, many more of them are not. So many of the women in Adams in the Adams papers are not so much the national leaders of organizations, but they're kind of the foot soldiers. They're the secretaries that work in the NASA office, or they're the Hungarian peace activist who is managing the Women's International League out of Prague. That's not in Prague. That's not in Hungary. So they're not always the top level of the leadership of these movements. But what we're building is this understanding of how these organizations really worked and who the people were that made them work. Just pop over here. So one of the big challenges for us is in the progressive era. A lot of women are only mentioned as Mrs. or husband, as I like to call them, and that will persist even to their obituary, where you're just like, So some of the things that we find difficult is to identify the woman herself. A lot of times we'll be able to find a woman who was, maiden name when she was active when she was single, and then she gets married, and we don't necessarily have her married name because she stops working in the movement when she gets married. So a lot of times we're doing things like tracking down, marriage notices in newspapers, trying to get the full story of her life and what her full name should be. Again, we sometimes find an obituary and we have to go track it back to try to find the maiden name because we really want to tell the whole story of these women. So we do a lot of work digging with the census and passport records, one of my favorite resources because of the photographs. We try to then tie the records that we're finding to the organizations the women were involved with. So if you were a member of the Women's Peace Party, we have a way to link you to that organization in our setup. We can also link you to the suffrage group you might have been in or other peace groups you were in. And the idea is that we do that. We also try to identify them with the kinds of occupations they did. We're much more holistic in our occupations. Most of these women, if you look at the census, it says none. I'm sorry, that's not going to work. So we've created occupations like peace activists, suffrage activists, religious activists, so that we have ways to identify these people with what they did, not necessarily what they were paid to do. Let me just pop up to the next one. So the other thing I think I alluded to is that the network has gotten huge. These are the women in the edition that are mapped on our digital site, and they're all over the world. In the beginning, again, they were mostly focused on America and England, and then as Adams starts working against World War I, she starts making connections with women all over Europe, and then she travels. She does a couple of world trips and goes across through Asia, meets suffrage workers, settlement workers in India and China and Japan and Korea. And those people continue writing to her. So the challenge for us is to find these women. The international women are far more difficult for us to find. The resources aren't necessarily there for us. The most delightful thing is when they had a conference in America in 1924 and a bunch of them came. So I got their birth dates because they had to get on the passenger ships. And they came to America. Thank you. So you've hit my records. We also have, language difficulties. I speak no other languages than English. I'm sorry. I'm one of those terrible Americans. But the idea that we can maybe leverage having people in other countries who could help us do this research. The start of it is to put their names on our website, even if we have very little information, except for they worked in a specific organization on a specific day, and they were mentioned this letter. That puts them on the site, and then they're searchable. And so as someone starts to search them, they're going to find out that we have a letter, and we might be able to make some way of reaching out to scholars in other countries who could help us with some of this research. So I think that it's a challenge for us, but we really do want to make these women more known. Oops, I went too far. Sorry. Oh, it's gone. Okay, forget it. I had a very cool slide with all the faces of a bunch of women. No, it's okay. Don't worry. So one of our goals as we flesh out, we're focused on the documents first to get them all in, get all the people in, but then we'll start working on fleshing out biographies as we go. And the thing I'd like to do is also turn that into data. Since we're using Omeka, the database has metadata about all these women that we're adding. It has their dates of birth, their occupations, their locations. So we're hoping we'll be able to use that to visualize things about the people so that the project will not only tell you about the papers, but it will also tell you about this network. So you'll be able to look at things like what women were in the suffrage movement and the peace movement, and maybe which groups didn't make that jump. They were more, patriotic and they didn't want to join the peace movement. So I think there's ways you could look at the way that Adams's network expands over time. There's a lot we can do with the data once it's all completed. So I think that's our kind of goal that we want to do. And I think learning about the local parts of these movements, like what was happening in Cleveland, what was happening in Chicago, that's a way that you can also start to get people interested in their local history and what the peace movement might have been like in the teens in your area. So as I used to like slide over to do some proofreading, and there'd be a list of 25 names, and I'd start looking at them and none of them are in the database. And I'd be like, oh God, this one's going to take me a day or 2 or 3. And now I just say, but it's good. Like, this is what we're here for. We want to pull these women out from like the dark reaches of history, put them up on the internet and let people find them. So that is, I'm going to pass this over to you. Does that work? Oh, that works.
I can use that, I think. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm Lindsay Peterson, the Senior Associate Editor of the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi Project, which I cannot say without like losing my breath. So I will be calling it CWRGM today. And our website information is listed here. I'm, young, so I also had to include Twitter as well in case you like Twitter, that's there. And CWRGM is an NEH and NHPRC funded digital documentary edition, and it's grounded in around 20,000 documents that were from the state of Mississippi's governor's administrations from late 1859 until 1879. So it's early secession crisis into Reconstruction and into the kind of entrenchment of the Jim Crow South as well. It's organized around 9 administrations, and the collection touches on nearly every issue of the day from a very diverse constituency. And so as much as your instinct probably is to think these are records from governors, that is not what's in this collection. And what is here are letters written to the governors of Mississippi from ordinary Americans, from politicians, from people, a lot of people in Mississippi, but from people all over the world and from all over the country. And so it's a really diverse collection, kind of from a bottom-up approach. And once you hit Reconstruction, this also includes freed people in Mississippi. So it's one of the first spaces that you can hear from during kind of your standard US history from Black Americans directly writing into the governor, engaging with the governor's office. And so the project was launched in 2019. It's directed by Dr. Susanna Ural at Mississippi State University, and it is freely available online. It has high resolution images of the original documents next to transcriptions. We have subject tagging and metadata and annotations and all of that. And I'm going to introduce you a little bit to what the site kind of looks like today. And from there, I'll talk about how those kind of pieces can be used to help increase the discoverability and knowledge about women in the collection. So specifically, I'm going to focus on subject tagging. So as many of you know, right, subject tagging creates a link within the document that allows you to see the original text, and then it connects that text to a internally controlled vocabulary, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about because we we've gone a more reparative route and abandoned the Library of Congress authority headings so that we could do that, in large part because the LOC authority headings did not cover a lot of the experiences pertaining to women's history or African-American history in productive ways. And so adding subject tagging with our own controlled vocabulary really provides a lot of exciting possibilities for helping uncover the voices and experiences of women in the collection. And for us, they fall under 9 categories. You can see them here. One of our favorite categories is social identifiers, which is like a group identity. And we have a diverse collection of tags in there. So military families, for example, is one of the subject tags under social identifiers. And so you're never going to be able to keyword search in this collection military families, but by linking the experiences of people who are family members of servicemen in the collection, we can put all those documents pertaining to soldiers' wives and children and parents into one space for you, which is pretty incredible. And it really helps uncover women's voices and experiences. And let's see. And so the method for us is it happens in From the Page, created by Sarah and Ben Brumfield. And so it's a feature of their software, excuse me. And it allows us to link that very terminology to a uniform subject tag. This is really important for African-American history, especially pertaining to women as well, because many of the terms that appear in the letters to describe enslaved people are varied, they're diverse, and sometimes deliberately confusing and misleading. And so by having our standard vocabulary, we can link those all together without having users have to come up with all of the terms that were used. And whatever. This preserves the original text in the transcriptions as well. So users can see the original text and they can see the subject tag. So if you see an saint in a document, you can then hover over it and see that this is a reference to pregnancy, and it connects to the reproductive lives of women in the collection as well. And then that takes you to what this is, and it creates an entire list or an index of all the subject tags in the collection. So it kind of serves as a form of early annotation. And we're actually in the process of making this go away. So we have these long lists of subject tags that appear in our collection. And as I mentioned, it's from the bottom up. So there's a diverse, huge group of people and experiences in the collection. We're at 9,200 documents right now. We're expected to be about 20,000. We already have 34,000 unique people in the collection. So we expect to be anywhere from 60 to 70,000 unique people in the collection. And so we're going away from this long list because our host can't handle it. We're actually looking for new hosts as well. And we are adding facets to that as well. And we'll be able to show military facets for military units pretty soon. And so all of these, oh, that's what I needed, was that tag, right? So you can see them all housed together. And this also becomes a space for adding an annotation to this as well. So you can help, that's basically how we're speeding up an annotation process for the project, is by having our annotations connect to a direct subject tag. And so that applies to every instance of that term in the collection. So you have to be careful with how you craft your annotation, but it populates to every single instance of that in the collection. So once you identify a person, they are annotated in every single document, and users will be able to see that information. And this can be updated all the time, which is really really amazing about it. I feel like we lost a slide for each person somehow. I don't know. So some of the exciting possibilities are uncovering the experiences of women in the collection who can be named. So one letter is Lucinda Cantrell and Mary Jane Smith wrote to Mississippi Governor Charles Clark in March of 1865, and they'd been incarcerated in the Lowndes County Jail for burglary and larceny. And they wrote to Governor Clark asking to be released. And so tagging these documents with the women's names helps you kind of uncover how women navigated these criminal justice systems. But it also allows us to do things like link the women to their aliases as well in the collection. And so through research, we can link all of that up as well. And so enhanced subject tagging features like these are incredibly useful, especially if you issue the Library of Congress authority headings and work to adopt kind of a new controlled vocabulary. You can start to really uncover and help the discoverability of women's experiences in the collection and start to highlight connections between these subject terms as well. So thank you.
There we go. All right. I'll be speaking about our U.S. Latino Archives, Literary and Historical and Cultural Legacies through our USLEH Center, Recovery, and Acapulco Press. So to give you a little bit of history, a lot of our work stems from a perspective of social justice. We began in the 1970s as a magazine, Revista Chicano-Riqueña, that eventually evolves into the Americas Review. And the Revista Chicano-Riqueña was founded by Nicolás Canelos, who still works and is a director of Acapulco Press at the University of Houston. And the role of this magazine in the 1970s was to bring together, create a venue where Latinos could publish their work in English and Spanish or Spanglish at a time when there were no venues that were made available to the Latino community in the US. And so it brought together community across the US from the West and in the East. So from the East, the New Yorkeños with the Chicanos from the California and the Southwest, brought them together through this one magazine where there was a lot of like literary production that could be made available to a large communities. It not only did that, but as you can see, the artists were also included and featured within the magazine, as well as scholarly work. At this time in the US, scholars who were producing work or were doing anything related to US Latino, that was not allowed for tenure cases. It was not allowed for dissertations or any type of that work. So this community had to find different outlets to prepare these materials and to make them available to other communities. This was basically the foundation for what we now know as US Latino Studies. Arte Público, the Revista Chicano-Riqueña eventually evolves into a full-fledged publishing house, which we now know as Arte Público Press. Arte Público Press continues to publish books for and by Latinos in the US. That's our mission. It's a nonprofit organization. We publish books for children, young adults, we work with various grants from different organizations, the National Endowment for the Arts, for instance, local grants from Houston. And so you see the breadth of our work is still very founded in this idea of doing work for and by the community of Latinos in the US. We began doing a lot of scholarly editions through the Recovery Project, and Carolina will tell you a little bit about it. But some of the scholarly editions that we did primarily were done in print. And you can see that the things that were featured in our scholarly editions were basically to provide an introduction that could culturally, historically, and literally provide a context for why this work was published in the US. And these are a lot of materials that had either gone out of print in the US or were at once published and then they were no longer available. So we were creating new editions of this work. A lot of times we provided translations into English or Spanish. And of course, thinking especially after yesterday's plenary about language, thinking about how to document and establish the presence of these communities that were Spanish speakers and were producing and participating just like any other American in the US, creating, making these editions available in contemporary times, but also providing translations that could accurately depict the communities that they were representing, right? In many cases, we include facsimiles or transcriptions whenever we have an opportunity to reproduce the work exactly as it is, and it'll be legible to communities, to modern day communities. We do that as much as possible. Sometimes, that's not available. but we do OCR scanning, we correct minor, minimal typographical editing, and then we provide ancillary materials. The new editions that we are creating now through Manifold, which I don't know, many of you are familiar with Manifold through the University of Minnesota. Through Matt Gold's work, have allowed us to create digital editions that can be annotated and that are reaching audiences in a stronger and faster way. And so one of the reasons why Carolina and I decided to create a digital humanities center was precisely because out of the work that we were doing through Arte Público and the recovery program that we could only be done in print, we knew that we needed to go into the virtual space and begin to make more of these materials accessible to a larger community. And here is an example of a collection that was donated to us by a Chicana artist, activist from San Antonio, Ángela de Hoyos. And I just want to show you very briefly some of the things that we've done with this collection, because if anybody who is familiar with Ángela de Hoyos, most people know her as a Chicana activist. But what most people don't know is she was self-taught. She was an artist as well. She was a lyricist. She was a publisher, a poet. And so we use Omeka to showcase and to do digital exhibits of their work. And this is the beautiful things that we can see through Omeka and through the digital editions that we're preparing. We get to trace down the process of her writing in the work that a lot of Chicanos were producing in the 1960s, 1970s and 80s. We see a lot of this type of work that involves the art and the text. And then there's the richness of all the political prints. In the very last one, the one in the blue, you see full-fledged the different communities that she's represented, her Chicanismo, her feminism, her activism, right? All engulfed in this one image that really is talking about how Latinas have to speak up for their communities.
Hello. So I'm going to talk about the other, group under the umbrella of Arte Público Press, or the archive. So in 1992, a group of scholars realized that the history of Latinos and Latinas was not being preserved in the traditional archive, so they were finding things in attics, through their research. They were collecting things themselves, finding newspapers, and how delicate the newspapers are. So they decided to create a program to locate, preserve, and make available all the written legacy of Latinas and Latinos from the colonial times until 1961 and now 1980. So a very ambitious, endeavor. But after 30 years of work, or more than 30 years of work, the program has flourished, and we have become the archive, one of the archives for all this literature and history. So we've been able to create an archive with what we believe is one of the biggest collections of newspapers. Sorry. So I'm not very used to the mics. So what we have done is to be able to create one of the biggest collections of newspapers. We have in-house around 1,500 newspapers. Our archive was produced in the United States by Latinas and Latinos, and I want to reiterate that. And the archive is probably 85% in Spanish, but also is represented in other languages. Latinos and Latinas write in different languages. So English, we have trilingual newspapers in English, Spanish, and French, and we have newspapers in Ladino, and we have a big representation of women's writings, women publications during that time. When you think that Latinos were not publishing before 1960, or people don't think that, much less women, right, Latinas. So we have been able to uncover, along with family members and researchers, a lot of Latinas publishing anarchist newspapers, publishing, correspondence, manuscripts, you name it. So we have even a magazine called Feminismo Internacional,
that was published in New York in the 1920s, and it was in conversation with the Anglo feminism at that time and positioning themselves as something different, and and asking for that space for themselves to be to push for their own feminism. So we have all that you can see in the slide. I don't want to take that much time, but we have papers, we have poetry, cookbooks, photographs, theater pieces, etc. So we are an archive. We're mostly a digital archive. And what we do is create databases. We work with students, we work with graduate students, undergraduate students, high school students every summer, and elementary school students. We bring the archive to elementary schools to work with kids. So as early as they know that they're part of the archive, our community knows that, our kids knows that they're part of the archive. It's very important, and they realize that, and we saw that this last year with Gabby. So we create databases. We use Library of Congress subject headings because we want to be part of the conversation. We want these things to be discoverable, but also we create our own subject headings to fill those voids, and also to we create keywords. And we've been creating these databases for some years, probably 28 years. We started digitizing materials when the highest resolution for TIFF was 90. So we've been evolving through time, with all the information. As you can see in photographs, we work very hard to get our own equipment. So we digitize things in-house. We work as that is now called post-custodial, the way that is now called post. We've been doing that for a long time because we understand the reluctancy of our communities to donate or to share these documents with the traditional archive. So they know that they can bring things to us. We can digitize stuff, send it back to them, and give them a digital copy. Teach them some of the software that we know that is they're free, and also because we see this as a partnership. That they are the owners of this knowledge. They are the creators of this knowledge. So we are not seeking just to write a book or do something, although it's really important in academia. We really value our partnership with our communities. And one of the projects that we have several projects at the program. We work with students, like I said, and this specific project is very similar, and what you're doing, and I can see the connections in them. We need to talk about this later, because one of the most important things that we do is that we create context. You can probably find some of these materials online after Google, digitize many of libraries around the country, but if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not gonna find it. Or if you know what it is about, you can misread it or you can misinterpret this information. So what we do is that we create context for this information. And we've been creating a database for, we call it authority list, but a list of names that we found in the newspapers. Let me backtrack. We started reading newspapers. When we were students with Gabby, we were research assistant in the program. So what we did was to read the newspaper, the whole newspaper, sometimes years of newspapers, and we collected names.
And expected literature.
Related to literature. Literature for us is very broad, editorials, essays, etc. So we collected names, we created a big database, and we tried to find out who these people were, and they were published in the newspaper. So we did all that work, and a few years ago, we realized that we had like more than 5,000 names. And most of the women's names were like just the name, right? So we said, what do we do with this? We need to create something that demonstrates that we were there. We were participating, we always participating in the intellectual conversation. So we decided to use Graph Commons to create with a student. She helped us find the PCs, find the data, the software. And we created that, and we like this because it's like kind of like in your face, it's like all the names everywhere, connections, and you can see the big dots are the newspapers and the little ones are the names of the authors. And we decided to put all the women that publish, and we have a big one for everybody, but this one is specific for women. So we added all this information, and you can see any moves, and it's really cool. And it creates an impact. When kids, when students, when people see this, you cannot deny that we were there, we're present. Something like this, an archive like this, tells our communities that they've always been here. So, I'm gonna stop here.
The other one really quickly.
Yeah, really quickly. And then one of the most beautiful things happens in projects like this, trying to find people. One on, and I'm gonna finish with something personal that happened to me. So this, I was working on my dissertation with women writing in the newspapers. I found a poem about exile published in El Paso, Texas, a long time ago. And it was just a name. You know, I couldn't find who this woman was, and I couldn't include it in my dissertation because I couldn't find anything else. During the pandemic, somebody said, my friend is ready to share her archive. So I went to Laredo looking for newspapers. We were looking for newspapers. We found 50 newspapers we didn't even know existed that were published in the United States on the border. And then she brought a box. And you can guess, right? It was this woman. And the whole archive was there. The manuscripts, everything. It was an amazing experience. So, and this is, you know, one of the marvelous things that happened in the archive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so many connections, and this is such a rich topic. I'm going to start with the questions that the panelists provided to kind of open the conversation up, and then I will open it up to the audience after that. The first question, I think some of the answers of this came up in the presentation, so we'll see. But was editions are best known for providing access to documents and for contextualizing them? How do the biographical entries in your edition serve to unbury forgotten histories? So maybe just some specific examples that you can think of.
Sure, why not? So because we annotate to our subject tags, as I was mentioning earlier, we can use census, of course. I'm extremely jealous of the passport records that you get to use. But census, newspapers, et cetera, to uncover, when possible, maiden names, and even kind of connecting to your family history and give you more information about like family income, if you were married to a Confederate veteran, et cetera, is really, really important. One of the things that becomes even more challenging, though, is as we've been mentioning, so many of the women in the collection are not mentioned by names. And so one of the ways we kind of fill in there are making sure we have kind of those group identities also tagged in those documents. So even if we cannot identify, you know, unknown comma Margaret, you can identify that you know, Margaret was maybe impoverished, or Margaret worked as a seamstress, et cetera. And you can kind of start to flesh out some of that identity within the documents themselves and build a bigger picture. And so that's been helpful and useful for us.
And I think that in our edition, sometimes we don't know very much about the person the first time their name comes up. Their name might be spelled wrong in the document, especially if they're foreign people. There's some real butchering that goes on in some of these documents. But if you add the name as you have it, and you do some research and you find nothing, but then, you know, 3 months later, the name comes up spelled slightly differently, and you're like, aha, and then you start doing that research. So it's just the fact of recording these names, even if they're not perfect when you start, that they get refined as you go on, as you get more documents that mention the person, or you see that one program where the name is spelled differently, and then you start doing searches, voila, they come up. I'm always amazed at how bad some sites like Ancestry that often are very intuitive, but sometimes when you get one letter wrong in a name, they don't find a thing. And then you put the right letter in, and all of a sudden there's like 17 records. You're like, are you kidding me? So I think that, you know, just that kind of building it piece by piece has been the part that helps the most in having a place where they all live in the meantime.
Yeah, I think it's important to you know, we decided early on that even if that writer just produced a letter that we or a line that we could find, we just pick it up, we save it in our archive. And also with the name Violeta, you know, we couldn't find anything else. And I remember building this network. One of the students said, oh, well, what we've been talking, and we think that we should take out all the ones that we can find. I was like, no. You know, that educating too, right? It's very important, educating our students and how to read and how to do the research and how to see, really see between the lines. That's very important. And I think it's a valuable lesson in a sense.
So just having a name in an archive is like a radical act for a woman.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
If I may add, just speaking about what you said about teaching how to read, because and it reminds me about what was mentioned yesterday in the plenary, because we already have a lot of records that seem to have already been completed, right? But when we reread as women, right, as ethnic minorities, we read between the lines and we're able to make visible these other voices that have not been made visible, or because they were misspelled, but we understand those misspellings, those lead to other connections. And I think we're in such a beautiful position now that we have the opportunity to correct, to add, right, to annotate, and to hopefully, write those records and with these, and complete them, right?
Another question is, and you've answered this in terms of building the archives, but there might be other ways of thinking about it, which is what are some of the particular challenges you've uncovered in documenting the lives of women or in identifying lesser known historical actors? But I'm thinking that this is also relating not just to doing the work that you do or that we do, but also in terms of funding, in terms of kind of broader networks of support for this work. If you could speak to that.
I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that it's often the women's papers don't get archived. People don't think they're important. Even the woman herself doesn't keep her papers. When she stops working in a movement, she might just discard them. Family members often don't think they're important. I don't, not with Jane Addams, but with the Margaret Sanger papers, we found, the grandson of the woman who headed the birth control league after Sanger, and we're like trying to get this woman's letters. And he's like, wow, I never knew my grandma did any of that stuff. And I wish I had kept her papers, but I don't think there are any papers, and no one, their family didn't know that she was this national leader of an important social movement in the middle of the 20th century. And I think that, just that kind of, that doesn't happen as much with, I think, the men. I think that they see them, they understand that what they're doing is important, and they make sure people know it, and they save their record. A lot of times we're looking at women's records that even Jane Addams didn't save all of her stuff. She burned her personal stuff, a lot of it anyway. So there's this feeling, I think, sometimes that the records aren't as important for saving, and that immediately limits you on what you can find about the women going forward.
Yeah, I think that it's one of the incredible things that happen to in this sense is when we're able to complete an archive, right? When we have family member coming and destroying and saying, I have this and we should have saved the rest, right? We don't have it. And then if they publish in newspapers, we can go to our database and look for whatever they don't have and give them back that part of the archive. We complete both archives. If we've been able to do that with family members and also with other countries. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that for us, we had a strong network of Chicana and Latina elders in our academic community that taught us how to do this. So, I mean, you see us here, but we're in the shoulders of all these incredible women that were doing this work before us, that, we didn't find all these names by ourselves. They were, published and researched by other Latinas before us. So we'll keep building on that. And Gabby always says this, and we hope that our students are gonna keep building over this work as well.
Yeah, we really practice like enact the practice of generosity in building towards the future, right? Thinking about we're not killing the mother figure, right? We're always thinking about teaching the infection in the sentence article by Susan Aguba, right? And Sarah Gilbert, and how important it was for us to think about, we are not, we don't exist in an absence, right? We do have the tools to produce, and we can continue to produce and to share that knowledge, right? And the more that we get to share that knowledge and that training with other generations, hopefully, we won't be in a position where we will continue to recover a lot of these materials. However, academia is ruthless, right? To Latina women, to women who are writing in languages other than English. So in my field in Spanish, I have to publish in English in order to get, full, right? even though my field is in Spanish, right? And so there are the more that we think about like academia, the spaces for publishing these types of work, you know, are not as receptive to women, right? To these types of archives. So I think it's a still very difficult situation, because how do you empower younger generations to pursue this type of work if academia in the end is going to turn around and say, well, you have to do it in you know, following these parameters.
It seems to me, listening to y'all, like the collaborative nature of kind of bridging those gaps between your project and the community members that it serves and comes from is so important. So recently we've started reaching out with Afro-American historical and genealogical societies. And I think there's a tendency with historians sometimes to be like, oh, genealogy, like, you know, it's not real work. But meeting with those members has been incredible, because many times these are their ancestors' records, names being used, talked about, labor to make some of it. And they can fill in so many gaps, because as you said, right, women, especially when you add class and ethnicity and race into it, their records aren't going to be preserved and made like as easily findable on Ancestry, and we work remote, right? So we have to access everything online. But by creating relationships with the people who join OGS, we're able to find out information that, oh, that was my ancestor and was enslaved by so-and-so. She actually has this chosen name, et cetera. And it doesn't have, like, you're not going to do it for tens of thousands of records, but those moments can be like really important for helping to uncover some of those voices by going beyond your Ancestry newspaper subscriptions.
This is the last one that I have, and then I'm going to open it up. But how do women's documents differ, or do they, from documents produced by men?
I came up with that question earlier, and I was actually talking to Paul at lunch, and I'm like, so Paul, I've never edited a men's collection. And then we started talking, and we actually sort of agreed that with women's papers, there might be less of a distinction between the personal and the professional, that the letters that we have with women, the first 3 paragraphs might be, you know, about their husbands and their travel and how they're feeling. And then the next 3 paragraphs are about the peace movement and what's going on. And then they'll end with some gossip about someone else. And, you know, there's not an easy separation between the two. So I think that the women's networks were a little bit more friends and like emotional friends than some men's networks might be. And I think, so you get a broader range in women's documents, I think, of the whole personal life plus professional life. I'm not 100% sure that's true, because as I said, I've never edited men's papers. But I think that's the basic takeaway, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. And I was trying to think, you know, we're working on an anthology with Gabby on many of these women that were you know, working in the archive, and yes, you're completely right. And also a lot of as we work on this anthology, and this anthology, I can see that many of the works work, you know, talk about women's rights, and it's been incredible, because we tried to pick up from different people, you know, and we ended up with a huge corpus of women's rights writing in poetry, you know, and you know, we also need to consider too, well, we mentioned before about the, you know, class. We need to include that into the conversation always, you know, but I would agree, you know, yeah, they include, because that's the world that they're living in, and they have to get out and somehow connect it. If they're publishing outside, they have to connect it so they're published. You know, they're not out of the conversation.
But I want to think about we have several archives from women who were very like important and powerful. I'm thinking about Leonor Villas de Magnon, who had like communication with the presidents from Mexico, right, during the Mexican Revolution. And her tone, because she was, you know, an aristocrat, and, you know, and she had a lot of money. So it's like two por two, like, you know, they're on the same level and they're speaking to each other, right? But then we have Maria Cristina Mena, who was a contemporary to D.H. Lawrence, right? And they have letters that, you know, where they exchanged. And in her collection, you see different registers, But in Leonor Villegas de Magnon, I would say that a lot of her work is very similar to the work that we see in the Alonso Perales collection.
It's
Right.
the founder
The-
of LULAC, yeah.
So it does have to do a lot with class, I think, and
Yeah,
power,
access to
right?
power.
Because they were all very aware about, maybe Maria Cristina Mena not so much, but Leonor Villegas de Magnon wanted to leave her legacy, so she made sure that her records were kept in one place so they could be like, inherited to somebody else. Alonso Perales was a lawyer. He was the founder of the League of United Latin American Citizens. So he had, that same idea. Whereas Maria Cristina Mena was a writer,
Yeah,
right?
not so
She
much,
was
yes.
not concerned about her political position. So I think it does have to do a lot with power.
I'm gonna pivot slightly and cheat a little bit and look a little bit more at like the differences in editing the different documents, because we have both in the collection. And as I mentioned earlier, so often like women's names, experiences were like devalued historically. So, so Library of Congress authority headings doesn't often have a subject tag for that. But also it can be really difficult to decide like what types of categories do you put things for women under. So I think housewives is like the perfect example,
Yeah.
because we have occupations and we have social identifiers. And if the developers don't make something where we can put it in both, by just putting it as a social identifier, you're ignoring the fact that that woman was a massive economic contribution to her household. And even though it didn't have like a dollar sign paycheck, trade always attached to it, it was still economically important, and it was an occupation. And so by having like subject tags that can be put into multiple categories and like faceting that can pull up that in multiple settings, you can highlight how valuable those experiences were and put them on, to be flexible to do it, but put them on the same level as men's experiences. And so those identities are really like complicated. And if you can kind of sidestep some of the older practices, sometimes you can engage in a little bit more reparative practices and not replicate some of those issues of sexism woven into former editing or former tools.
This is just a really quick question to follow up on that. So like, how do those ever get changed? Like, and when do they get changed and who changes them? Those occupation and subject headings that the Library of Congress uses, and like, what role is there a role we can play in updating and broadening those? Because it just seems like work that this particular body, it would be particularly well poised to do. And I don't know if, I'm going to throw this out to the audience now in terms of asking questions, but if anyone has any thoughts about that, I would be interested in hearing them.
I don't know who makes them.
I do know you have to be stuck with this,
Yeah.
and it's not really, it's a container that we've outgrown in some ways, and it just feels like it needs to be revised.
We need a Library of Congress person here.
They're awesome. They're really, really great. But yeah, they, don't have enough people, and there's so many terms in the world.
I mean, at least for the Latino communities, there has been a lot of pressure put on Library of Congress terminology, right? And so there have been some changes, and we have been asked to participate in some of these things that they're calling like reparations, and come in these conversations to try to think of new ways, right? In how to incorporate some of these descriptions that are inaccurate or damaging to the Latino community. But I think it merits, conversations such as this one, and perhaps like following up with letters and, and communicating, from some of the various organizations that work on these things, so that, so that we begin to think about the limits of those terms.
I will say as a warning, some of the terms like appear like acceptable. And then when you start to follow their like previous heading, that's where you start to be like, oh, this was put under a crime.
Right.
And this is a person's existence. And so like that's, I think it's really deceptive as well in those.
Does the audience have some questions? Serenity?
I don't have an answer to the Library of Congress question. I think it's a really good one. So my question kind of takes us in a different direction. I loved hearing about how all of you are implementing these intersectional approaches as both a theory, and you use the word praxis in your approach to doing documentary editing or recovery work. And it got me thinking of two of our sessions we've had so far. The first from earlier today about working with interns and students, and the second from yesterday about what we can learn from the past and how we can use it, and it's still relevant today when we make arguments about social justice, about women's rights. And so my question is, in what way, what are some of the ways that you work with students? You've all mentioned working with students. And how is this work with students? Does it teach them about intersectionality when you're using these documents? And I guess I'm wondering in what ways, especially, if we think about the term intersectionality is a new term, it's a recent term, it's not like our subjects were using it. I'd be curious to know how you use the documents to kind of pull out this idea and this concept when you're working with students.
Certainly. So we within our office, we work, intergenerationally, and we use, we create a system where everybody is learning from each other, right? And so when we teach them specifically about how, when you read a newspaper or when you read a text, you bring in your own knowledge, right? And so we begin to dissect, but from what they know. And then we add all the different layers that item that they've read, has. And so they're able to begin to see different facets or different elements that are tied to that specific, document that they're reading. And so that's one of the things that we hope our students eventually will learn, that that the knowledge is produced by the document itself, those communities that they're reading from, who perhaps they are no longer there because it's a document that we may have recovered, or and so if those people were alive today, they wouldn't need us to speak for them, right? That's first of all. We have to understand our privilege as people who are in an academic environment, who have the knowledge of two languages, right? English and Spanish, to be able to produce, have the knowledge to write academically in a way that could be, published and could be reach other audiences. So register, understanding, right? All these privileges and how we're approaching that data. The privileges that we have in imagining how the materials that they're working with, whether they're going to produce a digital publication, a digital edition, or a print edition, and who is that going to reach, right? The other layer goes through when they work with my colleague, with Carolina, because she handles all of the metadata and working with all the different, like the tags, the Library of Congress headings, the subject headings, and how do we enrich all of that so that that material is legible to all the different communities. Our project is very ambitious because sometimes we only get one shot, right? If once it's published and we don't have a large investment, we don't have a large marketing team. So if it doesn't get into the hands of our communities right away, how can we make it so that hopefully it'll live and it'll get picked up through the algorithms, right? So we need to make sure that those tags are alive. It's like Lindsay mentioned and Kathy, right? We need to make sure that they're connected to everything else in a respectful, cultural, linguistic way, so that, Latino communities, as you all know, are complex. I'm Mexican, she's Chilean. We speak Spanish, but we don't speak the same Spanish, right? And so we need to make sure that when she reads it, she doesn't say, well, that doesn't speak about me. On the contrary, that speaks about me, and that speaks about my colleague in El Salvador, and that speaks about, so we need to make sure that hopefully it represents us enough so that we don't not want to read it because we think that it's, foreign to us, but so that we're able to understand that. And so those are all the intersectionalities that have to be there. So we work with students, undergraduate students, high school students, that, high school students come to us in the summer, K through 12, the fourth graders that we work with every year, we go to the school, and work with them the whole year, so that they begin to see themselves in the history that they're rewriting. Yeah.
So I just wanted to add really fast that what we do also at the beginning of the work, they need to read. We give them like a corpus of work that they read. That's part of their work, their hours. And the other thing that it's important for us to mention is that everybody that touches a project, their name is always attached to that project. Whatever they do, at the end, with the description of the project, they can see their name and they can put it in their resume. And we help them, write that resume and review that resume.
I think for our project, let me do your questions.
Oh, this isn't a question from me, but we have a comment from online from Ann Mansella having to do with the question about Library of Congress subject headings. She wrote, spouse of a cataloger here. Corresponds, you can submit an error report for updating names and dates. But if you're trying to change the wording of a subject heading, you have to submit a proposal to the Library of Congress. And there is an error reporting URL that she included there.
Wonderful.
Also, the cataloging lab is a group collaboration that works together to help write proposals and identify harmful language in the current Library of Congress subject headings. There is a website for that as well.
Thank you.
They're listening to us.
Thank you very much. You had a question?
No, I was pointing because we've been monitoring the outside virtual attendees. And this is the first question that has actually gotten from the remote or comment that has gotten to be presented to the panel. So thank you for taking it. I was pointing to Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for pointing it out. Yeah.
Thank you for the panel. I really enjoyed it. And I had a question for Carolina and Gabriella. And I was wondering, I was thinking about your archive and thinking about all the Latina women that come as refugees to America. And I was curious to what extent your archive includes like oral history components to record the voices of these women that perhaps had to leave behind all their records when they came. And then I had another quick question. Gabriella, you mentioned that you're kind of forced to publish in English many times. And I was thinking about the metadata and I was curious, is your metadata all in English? And how do you perhaps like translate that for your communities that are Spanish speaking?
So unfortunately, we are not working on history yet.
All right.
It's a need. We're working toward that. It's just so much, we keep finding more materials. We're thinking about it. We're training actually people. We have on board now another archivist that is specialist in oral histories. And what we're doing right now is that we're trying to work with groups that work on oral histories to support them so we can connect and rather, work that way because they're specialists. We don't have to be, we're not coders, for example, I don't know how to code. So I use free software, but we connect that way and we also, give a space to those groups that are doing this work to do that.
But in terms of the metadata and like everything that we do is bilingual. So yeah, so all the any digital publication that we have is bilingual. All our metadata, subject headings, all of that is done in English and in Spanish.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you had a question.
For me.
Yes.
Okay, so first I have an answer to Kathy's question. As somebody who's worked on men's papers, I think most of my colleagues will agree. Women's letters are more interesting and often more insightful too. Men can be terse when they write other men, especially in any sort of official capacity. And women often, I think we could agree, I think you guys would agree, are often write more freely than their male counterparts do. And my question though, relates also to the sort of challenge of writing biographies, IDs, whatever you want to call them, for women, which especially for us projects where we have thousands of people to identify and write, you try usually succinct, try to be concise biographies. It's so easy to fall into the trap of defining women by their fathers, husbands, and sons. And Kathy, you had a great, I thought, insight about, sort of, just inventing a occupation or profession. Do you have any other sort of like tips or insights into making, women's, like, oftentimes they're, 4 to 6 sentences more insightful?
Yeah, what we try to do is hopefully if the woman's been covered, the hardest ones are when you have, a census record, 4 times and she gets older every time. And that's it. And then she dies,
Yeah.
I mean, there's that
That's
old
life.
adage, like women should only be in the paper when they're born, married and die, It's like, those are the women that you just like, you pull your hair out and you're not going to be able to say too much unless there's a lot in the letters. But oftentimes, you indicate things like, a lot of these women, like, did I make the occupation club woman? Yes, I did. Because you look at an obituary and she was a member of the Sunrise Club and then this club and then that club. And it's like, what did she do? I don't know, but she did it. It's like, so, just like laying out, if you can get the details of the organizations they're involved with, even if they're, the Garden Society, that showing that she was an active person in public and she, would give talks about gardening history. So that's what some of the newspaper articles are about, and then they also, we also find from the letters that she was a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And there's nothing in her obituary that talks about any commitment to the peace movement or anything like that. So you're trying to fill in between the letters and between whatever secondary material you can find to just tell the story from her point of view. And one of the things we try to do with both men and women is that we have a little paragraph at the end that says like that they married somebody and they had these kids. And we do it for men and women because, for women, it does convey a little social status that you don't necessarily get from reading their bio. But we think it's just as important that you have the information about the man and who he married and who his children were. It may not come up in his letters, but it's still the same, treat him the same,
I guess your hand over there.
I had a question for the recovery project, I guess. You share some of your strategies you've come up with to like communicate your project objectives so that you can attract people who then you can work with to build trust and collect their stories and digitize their items. How do you make yourself visible? How do they find you? And then how do you work through that process, which can be kind of touchy sometimes if people are unwilling or don't even think their stuff's worth, very much. How do you address that?
I think it's a work of years, you need to know your community, or you need to, it's difficult to say, but you need to be that kind of person that is willing to listen and be very respectful. I always like, I'm becoming an elder too, but I always like elderly people and talking to people. And I found that this has been an asset for me in the archival world and, recovering collection, talking to people. But also just to talk to people, listen to people goes a long way, and give the time. It takes time. It takes time. You need to be ready to, share your phone number and answer during the weekend and have these long conversations because people want to tell their story. When you start listening, you can be on the phone for hours. They want to tell you stories. And that is so important for especially for the community that we work, our community, because they have not been willing to do that for a long time. And I'm an immigrant myself. So I have an accent. It's difficult sometimes, but that way that Gabby said, to be able to go from one language to the other, it's also, make you closer to people. And they realize that, we don't want to take anything from them. We want to partner with them. And we make that very clear at the beginning. We're not here to take anything from you. And also another way that we do it is that we partner with organizations in the community. LULAC, for example, that's been around for 100 years almost. So LULAC has different councils all over the country. And we work with one that is called the Historical LULAC because they have a lot of history from our specific town and the nation. So they became very involved with us and our work. They believed in our work. And they've been paying for interns because we don't want to hire students without paying them. So they give us $10,000 every year to give scholarships to undergraduate students to work with us. So we can mentor them and they can work in this history. So now we worked last year and after the pandemic, they were very eager to do this. We did a community archiving day. So they call their people and they say, you can trust them because we trust them, and it's growing and it's growing. And now they're asking, when is the next one? The next one needs to be bigger because we need to include the rest of the community, And of course, it's more work, and you involve more people, but it's so rewarding. I mean, it's just the commitment of doing something good.
And if I can I add something? For this specific community archiving day, what was extremely powerful, and it really the work that I had been doing, that we have been doing, I've been doing this since 1997 when I started as a graduate student working at the recovery. We had always only worked with paper and with communities who were reticent with working, with donating their archives. When we did this community day event, one of the community members brought her mother's apron, the apron that she used to, to prepare food for her family. And she is the daughter of her mother was this woman in the Houston community who was like the key point for people from Mexico they would write letters to her, and then she would share them with different people because she was one of the few people that had a house, like an address. And so she was crucial to that community, but the lady was didn't know how to read or write. And so she would just keep the letters, and she kept everything at her home. Anyway, just the story itself is really powerful, but the fact that somebody brought an apron to our archive, right? The fact that this person understood that her mother's apron merited being in an archive, right? Never had that ever occurred to me that one of our community members realized how their families' materials that were not just paper, not letters to the president, that type of thing, merited to be in an archive. And I think we're really coming full circle for our Latino community, especially in the Houston area, because these spaces are being built to support and to create, opportunities to be heard, opportunities to learn, and opportunities for people to know that they are contributors to the knowledge production, right? Not just, we're just gonna share this and you guys do whatever you want with it. On the contrary, they're sharing it so that knowledge is produced, with them, right? With these narratives. That's why for us, it's extremely important to not just take those voices, right? And put them in an archive so that, they're made available to researchers across it, wherever in Latin America or whatever, other Latino countries. But more importantly, we want for people to understand that these materials are producing knowledge on their own, right?
Yeah. No, sorry, I just wanted to add that's really important too, because going back to you.
I won't do it. I won't do it.
No, it's also because of the process, right? We go back to them. So we get the archive, we said in 8 months, we're gonna digitize it and we're gonna give it back to you. And then we said, okay, this is what we see. This is how we see that the archive can be portrayed in a digital format. What do you think?
What do you think?
What do you think? I mean, these are the colors and the fonts that we need to use for accessibility, but what do you think?
I thought you were referring to my tendency to cut people off who have gone over.
I think, can I say one thing? I'm gonna end it.
Oh, we had one question
Okay.
from Bianca. Bianca, is your question quick? Would you like to ask it quickly?
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you think that maybe in terms of, because we were talking a lot about the difference between women's and men's letters. I'm almost wondering, do we think it had maybe more to do with the idea of being observed or the idea of being archived? And in that way, do you think that kind of colored the way that women talk to each other with the belief that they weren't being observed in that way? Because that is true of like men's letters. They're very terse, they're very to the point, but I think I wonder if that has more to do with the idea that like history is looking down on them in this like grandiose idea of what that looks like rather than.
I mean, I think it's interesting because Margaret Sanger was acutely aware of her importance in history and preserved every piece of paper and donated to the archives, the Library of Congress before she died, just in case the US was bombed in World War II and these papers were lost. So she didn't think that way. She knew what she wanted to be important, and she knew she was. But I think that different women, Jane Addams is clearly less confident, less willing to put her personal life out there to the public. And actually her letters are terse. They're shorter, which is sad for us. But I think that there are different personalities among different women, but a lot of the ones who maybe didn't rise to the highest levels, I do think didn't think of their letters as being published ever, didn't think of them being, read by other people than the person they sent it to. And they probably were maybe a little more free with what they say.
I think that's a great question. In the case of our letters, no, because you're writing to the governor. So the assumption is you're going to be read, but I think there is something to be said about a difference in believing that you have a right to write to the governor, especially for women, and especially for freed people. I think there's a difference there in our collection.
I think this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you all very much. See you at the banquet.